Thank you for being here, and thanks for those who get the recording for your interest. We're glad you're here, and this is our second in our series of um, webinars that focus on advanced learning and programming in rural settings and small town settings. And for those that are interested, we have the webinar from last year posted on our webpage. And if you can't find it, you can call or contact us. And we're going to add our second edition this afternoon slash evening, depending where you are. But we're really pleased that Dr. Kimberly Chandler is here with us today from Johns Hopkins. She also has an adjunct appointment with us too. So midway through the presentation, she'll be switching her backdrop to Iowa. No. Uh, but Kim has a lot of experience in both higher education institutions, as well as in public education here in the United States. And so one of the things she did pretty recently was co-edited a book in one of the book titles, Identifying and Serving Diverse Gifted Learners, Meeting the Needs of Special Populations in Gifted Education. And her chapter was specifically on gifted in rural settings. And so I'm going to let Kim take it over, and kind of our format for this afternoon slash evening. Dr. Chandler is going to present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions. If you would put your questions in the chat, we'll address them there. And then if we do run out of time, Dr. Chandler has graciously agreed to give some feedback on other questions that we don't get to. So once again, thank you for being here. It's hard to host a webinar if nobody shows. So we're glad you're here, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chandler.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us after work. I know that's hard to think about focusing on something else, but I hope that the short duration of the webinar will help. As Randy said, I'll talk about 30 minutes and then there'll be some time for questions. So I will go ahead and share. All right, can you all see my presentation? Okay, I called it Rooted in Place, Identifying and Supporting Gifted Learners in Rural High Schools. And this particular topic is very near and dear to me, and I'll explain why in just a moment. As Randy mentioned, I work at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm the curriculum director for the Center for Talented Youth. And we run programs for students in grades 2 through 12, and I work on curriculum projects in the online space and also for our in-person summer programs. The reason that I mentioned that this is very near and dear to my heart is because I grew up on a farm in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And so this is a picture of my family's farm. Sadly, that farm is now it is being farmed by someone else, but both of my parents have passed. And so we decided to sell the farm, but we were fortunate that the people who purchased it bought it to farm it as opposed to subdividing it. So as I said, this is really important to me, and I think it's a topic that's not covered enough in gifted education. So why does this matter? So first of all, rural students make up 20% of the population in the US, but they are vastly underidentified for gifted services. And specifically in Iowa, typically about 7.3% of students across all types are identified as gifted. However, only 5.1% are identified as gifted. So in Iowa, they're underrepresented in gifted education programs, and there most likely is some sort of gap in access, identification, or support structures. And so this really supports the need for place-based identification strategies and targeted outreach. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So the session objectives are to identify key barriers impacting the recognition and support of gifted students in rural high school settings. Secondly, to apply context-sensitive strategies for identifying giftedness. And then third, to describe programming options tailored to rural students' academic and social emotional needs. And I wanted to share this definition with you, which I think is extremely important. And you'll see a citation there from some individuals at the University of Virginia. And particularly if you look up the names Azano and Callahan, they've done a great deal of work about place-based education. And I typically wouldn't read a whole definition to you, but I wanted to read this one because it really undergirds the rest of my presentation. So place-based education is an approach that grounds learning in the local community, geography, culture, and history of student surroundings. It values the geographic surroundings and the local community with whom one shares a common space and integrates students' lived experiences into instruction to enhance relevance, engagement, and learning outcomes, particularly for gifted students in a rural context. And this really is extremely important to think about as you're considering the students in these rural settings. So I've basically broken this into three sections that I'll discuss. And the first is key drivers and key opportunities. And the photo that you see here is actually of my nephew when he was a little younger. And this was a creek on our property where we like to play. And I feel that my background growing up in such a place shaped everything that I think about now. And when I think about education for the students that I have taught and for the teachers that I work with teaching students. So there are some barriers. And first of all, when we say rural, that actually has a lot of different meanings. So it encompasses a lot of different things. According to the National Council for Educational Statistics, rural areas can actually be on the fringe of urban areas. They can be fairly far away or fully remote from those areas. And when you think about those different kinds of rural areas, they have different levels of access to various things. As I said, I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and you probably never heard of this place, but the little town that I was close to was called Stuarts Draft. And then there was a bigger town called Stanton, Virginia. But the closest cities were Richmond and Roanoke, Virginia. And you had to drive about 2 hours to get to each one. Now, we were not like out in the boonies per se, but compared to many of the people that I went to school with at the university level, it certainly was very, very remote. And because of the setting that I grew up in, there were definitely issues regarding services and opportunities. Another area where there are barriers in the rural setting has to do with limited staff, long distances, and fewer advanced courses. I think that all schools in America right now face a lot of teacher shortages, but that's particularly difficult in rural schools. The school district that I most recently worked in was a rural Title I district, and the closest suburban areas were 45 minutes in one direction and an hour in another. And particularly for young teachers who are not raising families yet, we found that a lot of them really did not want to come and live in an area that to them often seemed remote. So I think that rural areas are always trying to hire teachers. As in many schools, but particularly in small rural schools, teachers wear lots of different hats and might have to teach across grade levels or subjects. And then in many cases, students may travel long distances, and that leads to its own set of issues. And also you have fewer course offerings in these sorts of settings. Now, we also need to think about the opportunities. And sorry, I have a typo there. I left a line in there. They're close-knit communities with strong relationships and deep local knowledge. Rural schools often serve as hubs of their community. And so that's where people can get together and socialize and support each other. The teachers know students and families well, allowing for more personalized support, and the strong community identity can provide a foundation for place-based learning. The high school that I attended had 95 students per class. So those teachers who taught us knew every single one of us well, and they knew our families well. Another opportunity is flexible structures, creative staffing, and innovation. Because the systems are small, they can be more nimble, and you have more opportunities potentially to experiment. As I mentioned before, teachers often teach across multiple subjects, So they may have interdisciplinary expertise. And then rural educators often are used to doing more with less. And so they're used to being innovative because they have to be. Another opportunity has to do with this whole idea of place. For those of you working or living in a rural area, it really is a very special sort of place, and you have access to resources that you would not have in a more suburban or urban setting. So, of course, there might be local industries, there's, nature everywhere. The schools that I attended were all sitting basically in fields. And so when we were sitting in class, we could see the deer running across the field or the groundhog and so forth. You just naturally, in many cases, even if you're not farming, know about the agriculture of your area and the history. Community members, if you solicit them, are available to serve as mentors or guest speakers or even project partners. And I think this idea of place-based learning, which we don't have time to get into in this setting, but I think that really gives the opportunity for engagement, identity development, and deeper learning for students. So I want to talk now about some context-specific strategies for identification. And some of these are really ones that you would see in other settings as well, but they definitely apply in the rural setting. So there are some traits of gifted students in rural areas that I want to mention before I talk about this. And whenever you talk about list of traits, what you have to remember is that no list really relates to every single person. Not every rural gifted child would have all of these characteristics, but these are just some things to think about. So one is a strong work ethic and practical intelligence. And students are often situations where at a young age, because of the farming that they're doing or the way that they're being raised, they're doing a lot of hands-on problem solving. And they may show their giftedness because they're persistent at doing tasks and they're very self-reliant. Many people who are living in rural areas, even today, are fairly isolated from other families or may live in a large family unit where they have to be self-reliant. They may show leadership in community roles. And I think particularly churches, farms, things like 4-H, church youth groups, scouts are opportunities for children to take on leadership. And these are things that tend to be prevalent in rural areas and are good opportunities. And again, it's something to think about when you're referring a student or you're thinking about a student that you consider gifted. Do you see examples of how they're taking on leadership? They may also have advanced verbal or storytelling abilities. And even today, we have lots of students in rural areas who live in close-knit family units or where the relatives all live close to each other. And so there's a lot of storytelling and oral traditions. And so you may see that they can shine in a storytelling format or in creative writing. Some other characteristics, obviously, one would be curiosity about the natural world. And when I just showed the picture of my nephew playing in the creek, that's one thing I think about growing up on a farm. Every single day when it was warm, we were outside all the time. We didn't come in, we just stayed out. And even in the winter, we would play out in the snow and go riding our sleds through the fields and so forth. And so just because you live in that setting, I think that you are exposed to things and experiment with things that really help to deepen your curiosity. And you're learning a lot of things because of these observations. You may also have limited resources in this setting and so have to do some creative thinking. And I think that not enough is said about this sort of thing in education or gifted education, but there are lots of things that when people live in a rural area, they have to think about doing it a little bit differently because they can't necessarily get to a big box store or get to town on a regular basis to buy things or to do things they might in a more suburban setting. And then there could tend to be more community-centered thinking. Many rural communities are close-knit, and there is a focus on empathy and helping the neighbors. So then as we move on to think about the ideas about identification. And you probably heard about using local norms in even in a suburban or urban setting. But it's really important to compare students to their peers within their own context. The second bullet that I have there is talking about using universal screening tools. And if you're not familiar with that, universal screening tools, that's used when you have a whole grade level that may take a certain sort of screening test. And the value in using universal screening tools is that every child gets the chance to be seen in a way that they might not ordinarily. Because when we do the typical gifted education referrals, a teacher is making a judgment based on some criteria about which student they might refer, and although they might not say it, they may have a bias against children from a certain background, a certain socioeconomic setting, etc. Also, many parents or guardians may not even think about referring their children for the gifted education program. My grandparents were all high school graduates. Actually, two of them actually went as far as sixth grade, and the other two finished high school. My parents were high school graduates, but no one else in my family, or no one in my family had attended college. So in my situation, there was no one in my family to talk to me about those sorts of educational opportunities. And although my parents were wonderful, supportive parents, this just wasn't something that was part of their reality or their experience. So you have many parents that just wouldn't think about referring their children for a gifted education program. It's also important to use multiple criteria in the identification process, including things like checklist observations and portfolios. Another really, really important thing is training educators to recognize the giftedness in these students. And so you need to provide professional development about the traits of students and helps teachers to identify these various characteristics. And then address the bias in traditional gifted indicators. And I think that this is a big deal, particularly things like vocabulary. If you were to hear my parents talking right now, you would hear that they did not have a sophisticated vocabulary. They would use the incorrect subject verb agreement, and they, would use words like ain't. I think my parents were very, very bright people, but they did not have a polished vocabulary by virtue of where they lived and their life experiences. And so these are things that I think that teachers need to understand when they're thinking about the students in their classrooms. And then there's also the need for flexibility. As we've seen with students in other contexts, the giftedness may be masked by things like poverty, trauma, or cultural mismatch. And, often when children from rural settings go into a more suburban setting, the cultural mismatch is very apparent. It's also important to use place-based checklists and get data from teachers, families, and community members. You can even get information from people like the Sunday school teacher or the 4-H advisor, scout leader, and people like that. And then think about students who need some sort of modification to what they're doing, not just students who look gifted by what we might consider traditional standards. And I'll spend a few minutes talking about programming options tailored to rural students. So fortunately now, I mean, if I'd said this maybe 15 years ago, this wouldn't be true, but there are many online and distance learning opportunities. And I would say that those have really played a great role in helping to make sure that there are good options for students who live in rural settings. There are existing platforms such as Renzulli Learning. There are other remote learning resources. You can also partner with libraries or community centers to provide access if home internet is limited. And then train teachers to serve as local mentors or facilitators for online learners. I do want to pause here and just mention something. This piece about the internet is a big deal in many rural communities. Simply, they do not have the infrastructure yet, or the geography may be limited. In the state of Virginia, there are lots of places that are very hilly or very mountainous, and one part of a county may have internet and another may not. Often, libraries are the places where students and families can go to get internet access, but the flip side of that is also thinking about transportation. During COVID, I was working in this rural school district, and we were partnering with a Virginia-wide online course provider, and there were teachers in another part of the state that had expectations that our students could hop in a car and go to the library for various resources, including downloading and printing documents. And in the county that I was working, there was not public transportation. So I think working around some of those things has to be considered. Another thing to think about that's low cost, it's high effort on the part of teachers or volunteers, but is to think about flexible in-school models. And you could create talent clusters. And this could be based on grade levels or subjects, but it will be a way to take a small group of students and cluster them for some sort of enrichment or acceleration opportunity. You could also offer independent study contracts for students with unique interests. One of my teachers actually in my Latin class, she had the whole class set up as contracts. And so you could actually take Latin 1 through 5, depending on your ability. And I mean, obviously, the teacher spent a lot of time coming up with these contracts, but this allowed for students at all different levels to take the course and to focus on that particular subject. You could also have enrichment lunch groups or before or after school opportunities. And then, depending on where your school is located, you could share materials or guest speakers regionally among schools. It's also important to think about building local and regional partnerships and really thinking about who the community members are that might support the schools. If you are a science teacher or history teacher, you could look at local issues to think about some project-based learning that you could develop. Earlier today, I showed you a picture of a creek in my family's farm, and one of the big issues that we had was that creek was an extension of a pond, but we were having problems with our pond because the neighbor was letting his livestock waste drain into our pond. And that would be an opportunity to bring in students to look at ways to restructure the flow of water and to also think about the water quality for humans and animals as a sort of project-based learning. You can also tap into many existing programs that serve rural areas, such as 4-H, Future Farmers, Scouts, and church-related projects. And then one thing to think about, and within a school district, there's a lot of title grant funding. And whether you're a teacher or an administrator, one thing that I would say that money is available in some instances. Title I money for identification of gifted students, Title II money for professional development for teachers. But you have to know the person who handles all those funds in your district, and you have to have conversations with them about how those funds might be accessed for some of the needs that you might have. All right, I'm actually coming to my conclusion. So Randy, I'm right on time. And what I wanted to end with is actually talking about my own journey as a student growing up in a rural area. And I mentioned that I grew up in rural Virginia. And at the time that I was in high school, the district started what they called a gifted education program. And what they did was that they took kids from the farms to big cities for cultural events. And so, although field trips are not my recommended means of addressing the needs of gifted students, I think that they are important for exposure because my parents just didn't go to the big city. So my first trip to New York City, my first time to see a Broadway show was actually through a school program. So in that sense, I think that that's important. I mentioned all these different barriers. The one barrier I didn't mention yet is the third one, and that's family values. And my parents, as I said, were supportive, but they believed everybody should stay close to home. And because they did not attend college, they didn't think it was important. My father, frankly, thought that I should graduate from high school, go to work in a local factory, or find a husband. And so they really didn't want me to move away. They thought I should stay close. And actually, in my family, almost everybody stayed close except for two or three of us. But everybody else stayed very close within probably 10 miles of each other. A critical turning point for me was something in Virginia that's called a governor's school. And now we have them both during the full academic year. But at the time, we only had them during the summer. And that's the first time that I'd ever really experienced academic rigor. It's the first time that I was away from home in a university setting by myself, and it's the first time that I had academic peer groups. So that was really, when I think about everything in my educational and career trajectory, that's probably the single most important thing that happened to me in my education. I also had to advocate a lot for myself, and because my parents weren't there to drive it. Fortunately, I had a very, very good school counselor in my high school. And so I think that the school counselors are very important in helping students to think about their future and find resources. The outcome, despite everything, and I had a wonderful childhood and life as a young person, but there were certain things just because of my family setting and so forth that were obstacles, so to speak. But eventually, I got an undergraduate degree, and then I got a master's and a doctorate. And so, I came a long way from my setting. The insights are that geography and culture absolutely shaped my identity and decision making. This sense of place influenced my values and goals. And then the last thing, I needed supportive educators and access points to bridge the rural opportunity gap. And I think about, especially the teachers my senior year were instrumental in not necessarily pushing me in a certain direction, but they absolutely felt that I needed to move out beyond where I was and to experience college. And they were key players in helping me to move forward. I'm closing with this painting of my farm or my parents' farm, which, as I mentioned, was very important to me, and which, this sense of place, as you can tell, is very important to me. And so I think if you're living in a rural area or working with children living in a rural area, you should really take advantage of that concept of place and place-based education. All right, and I'll stop sharing here. All right, I made it right on time.
Excellent. We'll put that in your review. No, thank you so much. It was so much great information and just about 30 minutes. Wow. Well, we're going to open up for some questions, about 15 minutes of questions if somebody has a question. Well, I can model a question because I definitely have one. And one thing I was thinking about is, identity is such a big deal and, just who we are as humans. And I'm just wondering if, with the internet, I know, that's, might be sporadic how it is in rural settings, but the representation in media has never been really favorable for rural individuals. And I'm just wondering if you ever heard of anything now that, there's more tongue-in-cheek things that you can see, videos or things about if it's, causing people from rural settings, especially young people, to not value where they're from or not to be necessarily embarrassed, which is my other question too, because, I just know a lot of other underrepresented populations kind of masking their abilities. And is that something that's common in rural students too, if they're really bright and That's not what the vibe is with their peer group or the school. So I didn't word my
Yeah,
question very well, but
I think absolutely that's the case. Like I said, my father really didn't want me to go to college. And in fact, we fought a lot about it because it just wasn't part of his value system. And he saw no need to spend the money and go away someplace, to go to school. And, I didn't hide my ability, but I've known students certainly who did that. And, in terms of the way that the media portrays rural people, frankly, I don't know that it's changed a lot. I think that, I still, like in the state of Virginia, I can tell you, even close to where I live, there are people that think that people from certain counties are hillbillies and people from others are not. And, in Virginia, we have what we call Northern Virginia, Nova, which is all the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And I went to William and Mary, which is a Virginia university, and I faced a lot of bias. It's still today in our General Assembly, there's a lot of bias from that very suburban area versus all of us in rural and even suburban areas. And so I think that there's a lack of understanding, and that's why I want to make sure that in doing this presentation, I had both barriers and opportunities because there are tremendous opportunities in these areas. And, when I talk about place-based education and the importance of place, I'm one of those people that it's just crushing to me to see the way that they're taking farmland and subdividing it for factories or homes and so forth. And so I don't really think that nationally we've given rural areas all the respect that they need necessarily because everything's about development.
it's interesting because as you point out, 1 out of 5 students come from a rural setting. So that's not a very small number. That's a large percentage of state school populations, I think. But yeah, I found that the trait list, I think other people would agree that the trait list and kind of the opportunities that do exist in rural settings when you actually see and you talk through them was definitely really powerful.
And I see a question in the chat here. Sometimes the only vision for gifted education is offering AP or college level classes. What do you find is the best way to open leaders' minds to other ways like place-based learning of serving tag students? Well, for one thing, I think that actually, you know, in all the things that administrators are charged with, I don't even know how much they know necessarily about place-based education per se. I mean, certainly as a concept, they might have heard of it, but I find that, a lot of the literature about it is very specifically about rural education. And that's just something that's, when I think about all the classes I've taken in my life, that's really just something that's not focused on, at any level really. And fortunately, these individuals from the University of Virginia had brought that into the dialogue about gifted education to some extent. But I think that sometimes as teachers, it's important for teachers to advocate for students and talk to their administrators about such things because they truly might not have even encountered that in what they're doing. And I agree. A lot of times the only vision is AP or the dual enrollment sort of thing. And that may simply be impossible depending on the location of the district. I mean, there are districts in Virginia or in the United States that, have all of their schools, all 3 levels in one building. I mean, they're teeny tiny rural districts in the US. And so that's where I think they have to work with other schools or other districts. But I think that, sharing a reading or something that you found would be important because administrators may not be aware of other options. And often, the voice of the teacher is strong and important in this case.
A
I have a
similar,
question. Oh,
oh, go ahead, Megan.
no, you go, Josh. I'll go after you.
Well, related to this question, but coming from the perspective of the Bell and Blank Center, every year we're kind of surprised with some comments that we get back that people are not aware of us or don't know about the services we offer. And we've been around for, going over 30 years now. And so it's sort of a surprising thing that that schools in the States are not aware of the things that we offer. Would you have any recommendations about the way that a center like the Bell and Blank Center could reach out to rural districts and, you know, do some networking or just make our services available in a way that's sort of respectful of the local, community, not trying to give off the impression that we're trying to pull kids into the university but in a way that's respectful, but also like lets them know that there is a resource out there um, that wants to help.
Well, it's funny. I had never been to Iowa until I went to the Wallace Symposium for the first time. And as somebody growing up on the East Coast, my perception of what Iowa would be a lot of fields, a lot of cornfields and so forth. And indeed, that's exactly what you see. So, the University of Iowa sits right there in the middle of a beautiful rural area. So I think that, one thing is what I was talking about before we even started, at some point on a limited basis, having a, 1 day or 2 day or something, um, rural institute. I don't even remember what it was called. It was a long time ago, probably 15 years ago, but doing something focusing specifically on rural gifted education. And that's something going back to the question that somebody asked earlier. Teachers could attend or administrators could attend, but I think, and then bringing in some of the local groups that could assist, things like Future Farmers of America. That's a great old organization and they do a lot of amazing things. But I think in setting up something, you really have to think about what is the rural lifestyle and what things are important. And, showing how your programs connect to them. And I think one obvious way is because we can do everything online now, they can also access you in online programs and so forth. So I think that, really capitalizing on that would be important. And Megan, you had a question.
Well, I think this is such important work, and thanks so much for presenting for us, Kim. Um, in our Javits grant, we've worked with rural communities, and I've just grown to know a little more about the different needs. And something that we've noticed in our grant is that we were working with communities to not make an assumption that if there's this desire that a student would want to leave the community, that there are ways to give back to the community, and there are ways to use the skills that you might learn in a talent development program within your community. So one of our interventions we've done is thinking about your community in 10 years and what that might look like and what might be some ways that you would want to contribute to that community, rather than sometimes I think, especially coming from the university, we can be perceived as, well, I don't want you to come in because I don't want my kid to leave the farm or something like that. And so how can we think about providing the things that we do within the person's community? And I don't know if you've thought about that, or there's research to kind of support ways of doing that so that it's not you need to leave. Like, I even remember just growing up in Iowa City, I thought, well, there's no way I can live here as an adult because what I want to do isn't offered in Iowa City. And that's just not, obviously that's not true. This is where I live right now. But, I think that is something that we need to be aware of too, that it can be seen as elitist sometimes, like the other, rather than how do you think about using your skills within the community that you live in and love.
Yeah, and I don't know any research specifically off the top of my head, but I do think that you have to consider that strongly. I mean, like I said, I fought with my father about going to college because he considered it very elitist. And, even when I came home my first semester from undergraduate school, I mean, he was watching for how I would talk and how I would dress and that sort of thing, because it was really seen as this alternate world that did not coincide. Even though, I mean, in Virginia, there are some universities that are in very rural areas like Virginia Tech. It sits out in the country in the mountains, but it's just, like you said, this whole elitist attitude is what I think scares people, and also the idea that people might change somehow. And you still have many students in our schools now that are first generation. There's still no one in their families who's attended college. So that can be scary for the family unit to think about how that person might change. And then there's a pragmatic aspect where really in many farms they can't afford for somebody to leave permanently. They need their help on the farm in one way or another. So it's also a threat potentially to their livelihood.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
I just have a question about the governor's school. You said that it was it was kind of life-changing for you because it allowed you access to people that you hadn't worked with before, kind of a different population. Did the counselors or the teachers from some of the rural schools ever have any experience with those governor's schools to see how they impacted the learning of rural students like you?
Well, my school counselor, I do remember she really pushed me to attend this. I mean, and there was an application process. I mean, like my school was only allowed one representative, and she did check in with me. And I mean, I think her goal in wanting me to go there was for me to see sort of a different way of being and a different way of living. And it turned out many of the people that I went to that governor's school with also ended up being in my undergraduate class, my first year of college. So it also gave me, an immediate peer group. In terms of actual research being done on that whole program, some was done some years ago, but I don't think anything was ever published. But I think any of those sorts of programs are important, and that actually would be an interesting line of research to track, to trace back to what is the impact on the family, and then, like you said, the learning part of it. And if you come from a setting like that, and not necessarily even rural, but if you're coming from a setting where you're first generation university, if your family does not have that experience, it's very different for them. And the fact that I eventually got a master's and then a doctorate, my parents never really understood what I was doing. I mean, all they knew is that I seemed to be in school forever. That it's just like, when will you ever stop going to school? Because it's just not part of their experience. And I think that when you're thinking about this high school counselor, they're trying to look out for the best needs of the kids that they're working with, and they're not so worried about the impact on the family. And so it's more that the children have to think about that. And it's a strong calling for you. I mean, I grew up beside my father's parents, and my mother's parents lived 3 houses away. Until I went to undergraduate school, I saw all of my grandparents every day of my life. And so for me to leave, and I was going to a school that was 3 hours away, that was a monumental thing, and so there are lots of family factors that I don't know if those are considered enough, in the literature, and what school counselors are necessarily thinking about.
Well, I can see a distinct parallel with students of poverty in urban settings as well, where the belief in higher education is not necessarily there, and they don't see the return for the money of the investment because they don't have that experience. It's interesting. I enjoyed your talk.
I think
It's interesting too that some of the solutions for both of those populations are very similar as well, right? Using
same.
local norms, getting down into knowing the student and the teacher relationships are important, talking to the school counselors. Um, yeah, I noticed the same thing, Jolene. It's quite interesting.
And University of Iowa has the program for school counselors. And I just have to emphasize, Suzanne's not in this call, but I just have to emphasize the importance of school counselors in all of this, and understanding that family piece of it, because, it can be perceived as they're trying to, the school is trying to drive the children away from the family, but it's not that at all. But the school counselors are very important, both in providing, making sure that students have opportunities and then understanding the family piece.
Well, we're sad but true. All good things seem to speed up like this. But I liked how you used the word opportunities a ton, and your slides had that too. And I think those in education notice the importance of opportunities for all students, especially students in rural settings. And I also really appreciated the opportunity of a well-informed teacher too. And I appreciate everybody being here. I know it's a long day, probably already a long week, and it's only Monday, but I think it's so important to, keep adding to our repertoire of knowledge and those types of things, our knowledge base. And so thank you so much for everyone being here, and especially a huge thanks to Dr. Kimberly Chandler for giving us great information. And wow, so much to think about in 28 minutes, whatever it was. So great job.